Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. Last week we covered the new API-driven provisioning service that Microsoft's come out with, which allows you to tap into any third-party data source, such as your HR software, your third-party database, or even a CSV file, to automatically provision users either locally or up in the cloud as part of an automated user flow. So I promised last week to show you more of the automation behind that process. I mostly showed you the initial configurations here, so I'm going to keep my promise here and show you that. It's mostly going to be a demo heavy video, but I wanted to quickly recap some of those concepts as well, just as we get into this, just so it's fresh in your mind. But again, we have our third-party sources. That's a better genesis for user creation that either comes from our HR software, if we have HR tools today. This could be from a third-party database that we host and has that information in there. And in a lot of cases with SMB, we're hosting it manually, such as in a CSV file or something like that. So with these first two sources, when we think about extracting that user data, we're going to need to hit probably an API that taps in directly into those database sources. Or if you host this database in Azure, you may be able to just grab it natively there too and pull it into some of the native tooling for automation that Microsoft has as well. You could also have developers on staff that go in and create automation behind this and tap into this new endpoint. But overall, I would say the most common use case is that you're going to need to hit an API to understand or pull this data out of these third-party sources. Now the CSV file is a little bit different because we can host that within something like SharePoint, which is what I'm going to show you today. And I'm going to be showing you how to pull data out of the CSV on a recurring basis, leveraging Power Automate to then tap into this new API as well. So the CSV file, again, you could use these options against every one of these sources, but the two that I'm going to show you today, one of which is using a logic app and hosting this in Azure to run basically an automated workflow to pull this information out of a storage account. And then the other of which, I'm probably going to botch this symbol here, but the other which is Power Automate. And I'm going to show you this more directly because I think it's the best option more so for MSPs. It's a free option as well, that we don't need to have anything really hosted in this manner to pull this data in. But when we go through this process, we also are going to hit this new endpoint from Microsoft. And when we do, we need some type of managed identity. We don't want this API or our API that we can hit to provision users or update users to be public. So we're going to hit that with either a service account or service principal or managed identity. I'm going to show you how to set that up. But basically when we send over this information or tap into this API, we're also going to be sending over this skim payload as well too. And if you recall from last week, this is what includes the hire date, the job title, the department of that user, all that metadata that then goes into this API. And the API service itself will either flow up into Microsoft 365 if you're just running a cloud-based environment. And then if you're running a hybrid environment where you have local Active Directory, it can go ahead and push that package down into local Active Directory 2 to provision the user on premise. And then you most likely have something like AD Sync stood up to sync that user up into Microsoft. So this is the fundamental flow. This piece of it right here is what I'm going to be demoing out for you today. And you can chain other automation events to this if you wanted to. As an MSP, likely you would want to chain creating a user ticket or a ticket in your PSA tool, basically to capture that this activity was done or flag it if it fails for any reason. So I'll be showing you all that today. So let's go ahead and dive in because I have a lot to show from a demo perspective.
Okay guys, so I'm here within an Azure environment that I've spun up some resources. I'm going to go over the logic app solution, really high level. Microsoft has a whole tutorial doc on this that you can follow. I wanted to reference it just because I took the time to go provision it and got some learning out of it that I want to share, but it's not my preferred solution, which is why I'm going to take most of the time on this video to show you the Power Automate flow. And I'm going to do it live as in I haven't spun it up yet, so we can maybe see some of the issues I run into together. This is the logic app solution though, and what they have you do is they have you host this storage account, and you basically spin up a file share within the storage account that you're using to host the CSV file. And the CSV file includes all of the information about the employees. So if I go into browse this particular file, I'll just download it really quickly here so you can see it. But within here, we have some pretty basic fields here as well, such as the job title, the department of the user, their full name, their UPN, very common things that you would see, including also their hire date. We give them a random GUID for their ID here. We have them set as active, which means that they're not, a disabled user or employee who's been terminated. You can use your own nomenclature and form fields for these as well too. This is just kind of what they recommended out of the box, especially going through that tutorial with the Logic app. In some cases, we're also referencing like a manager ID, which is the employee ID for this user that we want to make the manager. So back within the Azure environment, that's really what's hosting our CSV file. And from there, basically we've created a web service, which all that is doing at the end of the day is converting the CSV file to JSON. And then we also have this particular Logic app that is being used as a automated workflow, much like we'll do in Power Automate. I just call this employee provisioning here, but with the Logic app designer, this kind of has the overall flow for what we're doing here within the Logic app itself. And as you can see through this chain of events, it's kind of, in my opinion, doing a lot more than it needs to, but we're setting a reoccurrence here. So it's saying I'm going to hit this 5 times a day. So it would just hit the CSV and push the contents over. We're converting, the CSV to JSON, which is the web app that we spun up. That's its primary function for this as well too. And then it goes through and adds all these variables, updates a array of things that we're doing there. But then this is where we're also constructing, the body or the payload, and that's that skim payload, which includes all of those fields that we want to hit and touch to hit as part of the API. And this is all dynamic based off of it looping through, the CSV records that we have there as well. And then in the conditions, you're going in and you're looping through a certain number of them here as well. But the main action I'm going to highlight here is this particular bulk payload endpoint, which is custom to your environment. Again, you're sending that bulk payload, and then you're also using a managed identity that you stood up as part of the instructions as well as part of that authentication. So again, this isn't just a blind endpoint that anybody can hit with a skim package. It's something that you have to use token-based auth or this managed identity for within there. So I think in looking at this, it can seem very overwhelming, but part of the process as far as going through those steps is they give you a ARM template that you just upload, and all of these steps are already outlined. You only have to modify a couple, like the JSON body. If you've named your fields something different, you would just map those accordingly. And then obviously you need to put in your own endpoint here as well for the bulk payload that you're going to be sending over just to your Active Directory environment. It works well in the sense that it provisioned the user that I had within this CSV file, but I think again it's a little overkill, and I think it can get confusing just looking at this flow as well too. We're going to create something similar, but I think it's more simplistic, and we don't have to host anything in Azure. I think this is a little bit overkill because we also had to spin up this app service and app service plan. So it seems like a lot of resources that are really doing a pretty basic function. So I'm going to go and start to show you how to do this, leveraging an Excel file within SharePoint and then starting to create a Power Automate workflow. So I'm here within a SharePoint site. I'm just going to go into a document library here. And of course, if you're working this for a customer, if you're the actual IT within the environment of your tenancy, you can obviously put this in a central location. It's got to be something I would think that HR has access to from the standpoint of what you're trying to do there. So I'm just going to create a new folder here, and I'm going to call it employees. Okay, now I have that folder. I'm going to click on this here, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new Excel workbook. I'm just going to rename this here to employees as well, just to keep things simplistic. You can obviously name this whatever you like. And then I'm going to grab the same format that I used in the Logic app. You can copy this as well too. I'll put some of this into the description in the YouTube channel just so you can actually copy the text. Okay, and then from there, I'm going to go ahead and grab this information and just put this into a table as well. So again, this is oversimplifying things here, just from what we're trying to look to do here. But again, I just wanted to outline this from the standpoint of simplicity. I'm going to go ahead and rework some of these fields because I created Mike Jones as part of that logic app. So I'm just going to put in a different user here. Okay, I've updated this. Pepper Potts as the user here, reporting to Oliver still as part of this. But now this lives within my SharePoint environment, and I have my table here that I created. And obviously, if this was a real world environment, this would be a much larger table. The other prerequisite step that we need to do before we start working in Power Automate that I showed last week, that'll just give a quick refresher on, is again, we need a service principal or managed identity as part of the authentication here for tapping into this endpoint and making sure we're authenticated user that's hitting that new API driven endpoint. So I'm just going to hit new registration here. I'm just going to call this employee onboarding as far as the name goes. Actually, as a best practice, recommend that you don't use any spaces. This is going to be a single tenant application, and then you don't have to put anything for the redirect URI. I'm just going to hit register. This spins up a new service principal with this ID here that we're going to be leveraging along with our tenant ID. The other thing that we need to do is give it the correct permissions to be able to hit the APIs that we need to both provision the user and potentially look at logs if we ever wanted to do that in the future as well. So within graph permissions, you're going to add application permissions, one of which is the sync API or sync permission itself. So synchronization data dash user. And then the other one that we're going to hit is the audit log record. And that again is how we can monitor the progress of that provisioning activity that's going on. I showed that more so last week. And then you can grant consent for your tenant. You do have to be either an app administrator or global administrator to be able to do this process as well. And then the final thing that we're going to do is we're going to generate a secret. So this is basically we're using an OAuth token flow, and we'll show you that in Power Automate to be able to get a authentication token we can leverage to hit the API. So from here, we're going to grab our client secret, and we'll just say this is the employee test. You can set the expiration date here as well. And then you're going to go ahead and copy this value to the clipboard. So this is kind of something that you need to put in a temporary space for the time being. Would recommend putting this into something like Azure Key Vault or your documentation tool, obviously like IT Glue, just to make sure that it's safe there. You'll have to roll this every 6 months or whenever you set the expiration as well too. So after you've copied that, you're gonna go back to the overview, make sure you copy your client ID here, and then you would wanna copy also your tenant ID. Now, when we go through this, we're also gonna need our API endpoint for the service that we stood up. So if you need to reference my last video, go ahead and do that. But we spun up the API provisioning service in the last video. And so you'll want to grab that enterprise application that you spun up. And then within here, you're going to go into the provisioning section to get your specific endpoint that it created as part of the provisioning service in here. So you'll want to grab this provisioning API endpoint. Again, I would just copy that and paste it into a clipboard because we're going to need that within the Power Automate flow as well, just to go ahead and send that body or that payload. Okay, so now I'm in Power Automate. I'm going to create a new flow here, and it's going to be a automated cloud flow. I'm just going to skip over the template for right now. And so to start off our flow here, again, remember we're going to use a reoccurrence here. So we're going to use a scheduler basically to make sure that we run this at least maybe once a day from this as well too. So actually I think I'll need to search for schedule, and then the trigger we're going to have is recurrence. And so for this particular scenario, I'm just going to do 1 day, but you could do 10 times a day, whatever you wanted, as part of this trigger that goes and grabs certain information. So one of the first things that we'll want to do, and by the way, you could set this up multiple different ways, but one of the things that I'm going to do is basically grab a token to authenticate to Microsoft in my Microsoft environment so that I'm ready to hit that API. and then I'm going to loop through all the users within there to basically send that provisioning activity, whether that's creating a new user or updating users within there. So I'm going to use this Excel Online connector, and then I'm going to say list rows present in a table. So for the location, you're going to look where you put this as far as the SharePoint site, as if you're following along with what I'm doing here. So it's M365. The document library is documents. The file itself is under employees, and then employees here. And then the table we're looking at is just table 1, right? We just made that simplistic table. And here you could also, query out certain information. So one example of doing this would be to say, I want to query out every user with a hire date beyond this certain date. And you could use another action item to create a date field there. So that could be another way in which you don't necessarily loop through the whole table every time that you're doing this. But again, I want to keep this a little bit more simplistic as far as an MVP goes. So once we have our user records there, the other thing that we're going to do is get our token. So one of the ways that you can do that is just hitting a generic HTTP request to grab a token. We're going to leverage our service principal we created previously as well too. So within the action section here, just using the HTTP action, and for the method, this is going to be a post request. And the rest of these fields I'm going to fill out. I've showed other videos where I've done this in the past as well too, but this is something that you just kind of have a specific format for. So let me pause the video briefly, put this in, I'll be right back. Okay, so this is the format that you're going to use here. Again, I'll put this into the description, but effectively you need to put in your tenant ID here that we captured, and then your client ID, and then your client secret value here as well. This is again where you could tap into the native Azure Key Vault connection within here to pull those records. It's what I recommend to make it more secure rather than having these in plain text as well too. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename this to get access token. And I'm going to fill these out with my fields, but make sure you put in your values there that you copied and pasted into your notepad, wherever you place that as well. Now also might be a good time to save this and just test it, just to make sure that you can access that Excel sheet, and you can also access a token as well. So I'm just going to manually test this here. And we got a success message, so we were able to pull back the values in our table there, and then we were also able to get this access token here as well too, which is the value we see here. So because this is in a body, we want to parse out that access token because we're going to need it later on to pass in for authentication for the API provisioning service and that endpoint there. So we're going to use the parse JSON action here. And for the content, we're going to take in the body of this one right here. And then from the schema definition, we're going to generate from a sample. We're basically going to paste in what we got in that sample that we used as far as just testing out this action here. So click on done here, and then it automatically takes the values and puts them into this body. And we're doing that mostly so we can extract, again, this access token, which we're going to use a little bit later. So from this perspective, what we're going to do here is we're going to hit the new step here. And what we want to do now is we want to loop through all the rows that we got back as part of our CSV file. So we're going to use a control statement, which is under the control section here. And then we're going to say apply to each. And then from the previous steps here, what we want to take is the value. So it's the list of items that we got from the previous one. So that would be all of your rows here. And then what we want to do is we want to loop over each one, and we're going to pass in the body that will be dynamic in nature to this particular row, but also calling the endpoint that we copied as well too, which is our API provisioning service. So we're going to use another HTTP action here, and we're going to say, I want to rename this to send skim payload. And for this method, this is also going to be a post request. We're going to send the URI that you put in here is going to be that API endpoint that you copied previously. Within the header information, we're using the content type application skim-json, and then for the body, this is where we're sending that skim payload here as well too. So the other thing we have to worry about or enter is the authentication. And so the other header information that we're going to see here from the standpoint of the value we put in is going to be authorization. And then within here, we're using a bearer token. So you put bearer space, and then you put in dynamically the access token here for this as well. Now for the body, we need to send that skim payload that we want to have with all of our information in there. And so effectively, I showed this in the last video. I just kind of manipulated the sample that Microsoft put on their website in Visual Studio Code. So let me just pull that up real quick here. All right, so this is that skim payload request body that we sent over in the Graph Explorer in the last video. So for this, I can basically just copy this. And again, I'll link this. This is from Microsoft. This is a sample payload that we can send over. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and populate this into the body. And then we have this in plain format here, but some of the things that we're going to look to do here is start to populate some of these fields with the dynamic values that we have and got access into with the looping that's going on with our Excel sheet. So if we click into these records here, this is a little bit further down the page, but what I want to pull out is the worker ID, because that's truly the employee ID that we want to get for this particular record. The other thing is the username record. I'm going to replace this with the user record, which in this case is the user principal name. And then for the rest of these, again, we want to put in the values that are dynamic. So make sure you don't remove your schema definition there or your commas that are given there, but the given name is the first name. And then you have your display name, which again is another field that we need to pass over. And that is full name on our side. And then the nickname is actually the male nickname that is a required field, so that you'll want to have that in there. And then for the value for the email, it's usually going to be the same thing as your user principal name in most cases. So you can put that in there. And again, you could get as dynamic as you want here as far as populating all of these values into the CSV, like the phone numbers and all that. I am just doing this to provide an example, so I'm not going to put in everything, but I'm just going to fill out the fields that are in the Excel sheet for the most part. So here we have title, which I put in as job title, and then they're active, which is true, and then the employee number again. And then the only other thing I want to make sure is in here is the manager. And for these values, we're going to put in the manager ID and then the manager name. And that should be good there. You could do this a different way in the sense that you just create this as a separate task to separate out, the creation of this body, and then you just stick this in here as more of a variable. But let's see how this does just to start off with here. It might cause some errors, again, doing this more live, but I think that would be helpful in case we do see those so we can troubleshoot those together. So I'm going to save this here. I'm going to go ahead and test this. All right, we got a success message here. And we can see my data from my Excel files being populated dynamically here. So pepper pots, we've got all this information about them. And then we have the dynamic information about the manager as well, with the 200 message as well here too. The body value makes sense. So let's go ahead and investigate this as well. We can do so by going back into our provisioning service here. This guy. And then we can go into our provisioning logs. So this is from earlier here. I created this with the Logic app, but we should be seeing another one come through if this did actually push successfully. It does take a few minutes from what I've seen in the past to actually send this payload and get this into a provision state. But if we look in the users section, I do see Pepperpots was created here. And then we have our metadata that we filled out. So we have things like their department, their job title, their employee ID we filled out. Manager was Oliver, so that was on there as well too. Some of this that was hard coded, as part of that body that we pushed over. But it looks like everything came across successfully. But this was really cool to see this work on the first try. I think you could run into some formatting issues, those types of things as well. Let's go back to the enterprise app. I do want to see that the provisioning log was there too. Still hasn't come through yet. So let's see. I did notice on the main overview page, this did shift from 6 to 7 users. There we go. So Pepperpots, you got the record here. Gives us the payload that we imported here as well with all the user information. And then we have the modified properties as well too with the summary. So very cool, very simple Power Automate flow for the most part from what we were doing in here. Basically, again, just getting an API or calling an API to get an access token, calling our tables, and then looping through each of the rows to create the users. And by the way, this payload doesn't really need to change if it's an update. It will still do the post and it will recognize it based off of the external ID of the user. And it will just update their attributes if there's anything that's changed, like their job title or department, things of that nature that you could put into here. And then again, the list is not the end all be all, as far as the Excel sheet, I should say, where you're updating this record, just a way that you could do that. But you could also use something like a SharePoint list, and when users are updated in there or when they're added, you could then have this workflow kick off as more of a dynamic process that is less intensive on hitting every single user within the CSV file or the Excel sheet in this use case. So that's everything that I wanted to show for you guys today. I hope this was helpful. It is a really cool service, and I'll link all the documentation again, including that long body. I know that that's the one of the more confusing aspects of that. That's kind of clunky, but again, that was directly from Microsoft here as well. You just have to add your own API endpoint. If you do have any questions about this, feel free to leave them below. Otherwise, as I always mention, like and subscribe if you guys want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.